Hello everybody, so I'm going to be doing a presentation today about the ghosts and the analysis and significance of them within A Christmas Carol. So I want to start by looking at the preface, a haunting. In what way can it be seen to be a ghost story? So in the preface, Dickens says, "I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, Charles Dickens." So this is an interesting opening, isn't it? Dickens, I think here it is a fabulous introduction to the minds of Dickens. And actually for us as students, it's really useful in terms of understanding the writer's purpose. So one of the reasons that I really love Dickens is his representation of life and living in his novels. We know that he was really obsessed with the many different paths his own life could have taken, and what could now seem like an ascent into fame and providence could have easily turned into something much more grim. Like some of his characters, his life could have really taken a different path, a path of disappointment and failure. And so I think that it's through these characters that he is able to act out a fate which he could have experienced, could have happened to him. We know that his early life was not an easy one at all. And maybe that's why he presents characters like lowly clerks. Of course, there is Bob Cratchit, but we also have characters like Nemo in Bleak House, whose name itself means nowhere and no one. And we know that Dickens himself started out as a clerk, so there are quite a lot of parallels there. Or we could even look at characters like Charlie in Oliver Twist. Charlie, of course, is a name for Charles, who died in a workhouse. And these are paths or lives that Dickens himself could have lived. And Dr. Robert Douglas Fairhurst, he describes these as Dickens's shadowy twins, which I think is a fantastic phrase for understanding how Dickens puts himself into his novels and this novella particularly. So if we link that back to the preface, perhaps Dickens is trying to provide a humorous hint at the story and trying to allay a few fears, because of course this isn't a ghost story. Its main aim here is to teach us a lesson. It's to be entertaining, but also thought-provoking. We know that Dickens is interested in redemption and giving people in life a second chance through his characters, rather than the tragic ending that he could be giving them. And so to steal a phrase from Shelley, Dickens too maybe is a writer who strips the veil from the world. I think sometimes when we look at others' lives, we begin to question our own lives. And so this is one of the reasons we read novels, isn't it? But through reading his novels, we're not only able to escape, but perhaps be prompted to become better versions of ourselves. And it's hard to catalogue it as a story, and within a specific genre. It's often catalogued as a moral parable or a polemic, but it does, we shouldn't forget, have within its richly symbolic prose, all the hallmarks of a classic English ghost story that we'd expect of people like Collins or Henry James. So it has a brooding, living, natural atmosphere that reflects the moral condition of the characters that inhabit it. And there is, I feel, a visceral sense of approaching comeuppance or just desserts, the idea that you get what you deserve if you act badly. I suppose that we could talk about this in terms of karma as well. There is, for Scrooge, the protagonist, a slow burning journey from arrogance to confusion to denial to dread to horror. He goes to a haunted house, his own house, which is haunted. And this haunting is interesting because although it is quite original in its humour and its subversion of those conventions, it is also rooted quite conventionally within the Gothic horror, particularly in its eerie structure. In my opinion, Dickens is a master of mood and atmosphere, and to use his own words, it is a ghostly little story from the first scene. So in the very first scene, we get this sort of description of the brown smog darkening the streets and smothering the street lamps. And this therefore adds to a sense of some iconoclastic supernatural power approaching. I also feel that there's maybe only four reoccurring symbols within the novella. So we've got light, which could symbolise awareness, warmth, which could symbolise charity, versus juxtaposed with darkness, which can symbolise ignorance, and obscurity as well, so the fog adds to the idea of ignorance, and cold, which can symbolise want or neediness. And yeah, think about that, fog equaling obscurity, which obviously is a convention of Gothic literature, of the supernatural. So whenever Scrooge's vision is obscured by fog, darkness, or soot, we're also reminded, I think, of his unwillingness to confront to the needs of others. So Dickens often sort of symbolises this, I think, with the ice and the frost. Think back to that original description of Scrooge and how it makes him seem quite a cold-hearted individual. And then these are sort of juxtaposed, aren't they, with scenes of bright light, warm fires, and they do their best to offer Scrooge a vision of charitable awareness, but actually it's the ghosts that really do that. And I think that the novella is one which definitely exposes many ghosts, not necessarily ghosts in the supernatural sense, but maybe in a psychological sense. And we all maybe find those ghosts haunting us, perhaps when we're at our own bedside, ghosts of things like shame and regret, which Dickens described as potentially searing the heart and trouble of the conscience. Now, when we think about the first character of Marley, we're reminded that Scrooge's whole universe is haunted. The streets of London are invaded and obscured by the genius of ignorance. And Dickens warns us well in advance that there's going to be the supernatural and the natural worlds are due to clash. Both in his opening line, don't remember that we're constantly reminded that Marley is dead to begin with, but dead nonetheless, although he isn't. Or maybe he still is dead, but he obviously is a ghost. And his appearance is sort of a culmination of a haunting that has been occurring since the book's first pages. We know that that Marley is perhaps not dead, but also we've got this idea of London is haunted by Scrooge and Scrooges in general. So people like Scrooge are haunting the people of London. So the idea of haunting sort of has two different levels to it and goes both ways. And it's not actually until the end of the novella that Scrooge understands the shame and misery suffered by the damned Marley, whose heart is broken by his inability to intercede in the events of mankind. It was too late for him, and this idea of purgatory is an interesting one, because he is forced to walk the earth for eternity, and as he tells Scrooge, he wears the chains he forged in life, and therefore he becomes this sort of representation for us as somebody who is broken by these experiences, but he also comes as a warning to the reader and to Scrooge that it isn't too late for him. Marley is damned, but there is still chance for Scrooge to redeem himself, and therefore perhaps the reader. And you could also argue that it's a bit ironic that Marley becomes more human after becoming a ghost than when he was alive. And A Christmas Carol, like most of its predecessors in the Gothic genre, was made to sort of generate this understanding and conversation around the dreadful conditions of the industrial and the urban poor. And therefore, it allows us to explore this idea of humanitarianism, that what is it to be human? It's these values, perhaps. And actually, by having ghosts juxtaposed with real people, that really helps Dickens amplify his message, I think. So if we just have a look at the initial description of Marley, I think this is an interesting place to start. So we've got this syntactical parallelism in the same face, the very same, and it amplifies therefore the sort of the supernatural elements of it. We've got this previous repetition of Marley being dead, and this creates bathos, this shift from the supernatural to the natural, the normal everyday to the supernatural. So the idea that this is what he looked like in life, and he looks exactly the same, but obviously with a distinct difference now. We also have this sort of interesting simile here, which is an example of zoomorphism as well. It was long and wound about him like a tail. It sort of makes him seem like a creature, which I suppose you could say amplifies the monstrous, But it's a part of him. It's attached and it's inseparable. It's something that he's never going to be able to get rid of. Um, and it was part of him in life as it is death. And I think that the use of the ascendetic listing here is quite interesting choice by Dickens, because actually the list element emphasises and illustrates the things he valued in life, which are those of financial gain. They're not the key characteristics of humanitarianism and goodwill that I think Dickens is suggesting that we should value within life. So his body was transparent, so Scrooge was observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. So again, we're reminded of the ghostly element of it. So then we're introduced to the ghost of Christmas Past. And it's interesting because the ghost of the Christmas Past is he's rarely depicted in different adaptations as Dickens probably intended him. And one of the really great things that we have is we have the original illustrations that we can see, and they were really important to Dickens. They weren't just something extra that went into the novella. Dickens had quite an input in the way that these illustrations were drawn, as we know, and therefore he's telling us what he intended these characters to look like through the original descriptions. But I think that the first ghost is generally, Dickens wants to depict him with this sort of morphing, multiplying limbs and a jet of light atop his head, which is, if we think about Gothic conventions, an uncanny blending of age and youth. And maybe that's meant to represent the shifting nature of memory in general. So visually, he is modelled, or it is modelled after the German tradition of Christkindl. So this means the Christ child. And he, in German tradition, is someone who brings gifts to children on Christmas Eve, of course, under the paternal supervision of Father Christmas. But he's usually depicted as beautiful in youth and having a white robe. And that is quite interesting, isn't it? Because, again, that's sort of the Christ child element has these links with Christmas tradition, but also with Christianity. And like this gift giver of children, or to children, the spirit of the past comes to rouse and revive the child's element of Scrooge. Remember, Giddy as a schoolboy, this is something that comes later on. So this ghost uses their light to expose Scrooge's latent memories, so the memories that he tried to forget of his childhood. And remember that one of the 2 principal motifs in A Christmas Carol is this battle between dark and ignorance, and light, represented by fog, smog, darkness, duskiness, lack of light and lack of awareness. And then we've got the light through fires, candles, street lamps, and the spirit's flaming crown specifically. So this is the first one of the spirits, but his task is to shine light, therefore, on the repressed emotions and perhaps the denied misery of Scrooge's life. I find it interesting as well that as they're about to step out of Scrooge's window, the spirit makes a comment that it is actually often left out by adaptations. Sometimes they just have the spirit holding hands with Scrooge and them looking like they're going to fly. But the spirit asks Scrooge to let him touch Scrooge's heart with the promise that if he allows the past to touch his emotional centre, then he will be upheld in more than this. And this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because this has lots of different connotations and it links to what we were talking about in the previous lesson about the Jungian hero, I feel. But it also links to the idea that of Christianity and the idea of the afterlife, that if he can allow that to happen, if he can allow goodness into himself, he will benefit from that in the next life. And therefore, if he's not necessarily directing Scrooge, but he's trying to influence him in the choices of the present, and he sort of says to him, it's sort of like saying, remember how you felt when you were vulnerable and poor, and sympathy will help you sort of navigate life's ethical conundrums. So remember what you felt like. And this links back to sort of Dickens's own life, I think. He remembered what it felt like to be in that position that, he's not anymore. He's a successful writer, but he's trying to tell us this journey. He's trying to present us one of his shadowy twins. So also, right at the very end of this section, we've got, and that's what the picture is illustrating here, Scrooge tries to extinguish the light And the quotation, he says, but though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, you know, the cap, like, which is it's like what you would use to extinguish a candle. He could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. And I find this quotation really fascinating, actually, because it reminds me of the beginning of the novella when Fred visits Scrooge and he reminds the reader of the Christian values of Christmas. And he says, I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has become round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as they really were, fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, Bob, God bless it. And then Bob Cratchit, he sort of involuntarily applauds, I should say, but then he sort of checks himself and then he pokes the fire, and the quote is that he then extinguished the last frail spark forever in the fire. I think that this maybe is a warning from Dickens to not extinguish that light, not extinguish that awareness. And actually, because in this case of Bob, it leads to warmth, because he extinguishes the light of the fire and then he loses that warmth, which symbolises charity, perhaps. But what I find really interesting is at the end, despite Scrooge's efforts, he's not actually able to extinguish the light. He can't hide it. It's still streaming from under it, and perhaps this marks the first significant step in Scrooge's journey to redemption. He's still trying to get rid of it, but he hasn't quite succeeded in this case. So if we have a look at this description particularly, I think it's quite an interesting one. He's described as like a child, yet not so like a child as an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful, held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. So we'll just go back to this section a little bit. It's a really uncanny appearance, and we've got these juxtapositions or these ever-changing descriptions, and that, I think, mirrors the changeable nature of memories, youth versus age, the shift between, or the dichotomy between past and present, and innocence and avarice, greed. So he therefore is representing those two paths in one element, the light and the dark, what could be, what could not be, the past and the present, and therefore perhaps sort of signifies more prominently what Scrooge could yet be. And I think this is an interesting description here as well, because of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light by which all this was visible. So the light is symbolic of awareness, and his purpose here is to truly help Scrooge see his faults and see his next steps and what he could be. So then the next ghost, of course, is the ghost of Christmas Present, and he's probably one of the ghosts that is most consistently depicted in the same way as he's originally described, and this is probably because his charisma is so effective. So like the first ghost, who is modelled on Kris Kindle, and who arrived to bring light into Scrooge's ignorant life, you could say that the spirit of the Christmas Present, he's undeniable patterned after Father Christmas, isn't he, himself, robed in fur, crowned in holly, bearded and magnanimous, is open-hearted, open-handed. So all of that, elements of his personality, teaches Scrooge about warmth. So we know that the second of the two principal motifs in A Christmas Carol is the battle between cold or want, which is often represented by ice. And we can see this warmth represented through characters like Fezziwig, but also through this ghost. And this ghost really teaches Scrooge to value warmth, and therefore by proxy also value charity. And he'd been pretty miserly about this in the beginning, let's face it. So from his famous first words, almost always included in even the most sort of potentially irresponsible of adaptations, he says, come in and know me better, man. Okay, so the spirit is teaching Scrooge to value fellowship, community, and the common welfare. And then for 12 nights in a row, from Christmas Day to the stroke of Epiphany, so remember, we've got these sort of really biblical connotations here as well, and the idea of the Christmas spirit being one rooted in Christian tradition, not just what we come to know it now. And I should point out actually at this point in time that although I know we've talked about this before, but the fact that he has a green robe is actually how Father Christmas was initially represented. The red robe, and many people actually just attribute to Coca-Cola advertising campaigns. So he is at this point in time of writing in the Victorian times presenting him as a stereotypical Father Christmas figure or St. Nicholas figure. Scrooge and the spirit travel the world then watching almost 2 weeks worth of Christmas celebrations. And during this time, I know sometimes people have said that they don't quite understand the point of this section. He's taking them to see lots of different characters and not quite sure what those characters represent. But actually, he's confronting Scrooge with this sort of scenes of fellowship from all around the world. And therefore, Scrooge is actually forced to acknowledge what Fred had extolled earlier, and that's the inherent immaterial value of the humanitarian Christians. It's a mouthful. Humanitarian Christmas spirit. Okay, so when they first meet, the second ghost does urge Scrooge to look him in the eye, because like the first ghost, his mission is to cause Scrooge, the miser, to see the truth, to confront reality and accept it. So we need to think about the fact that he mimics Scrooge's comment on, well, if they should die, then they'd better do so and reduce the surplus population. And we know that links to things like the poor law and the Malthusian principle as well from Thomas Malthus. And he mimics him there because he's saying, really, is this what you still think? And Scrooge, interestingly, he follows the comment with, oh, besides, excuse me, I don't know that. He's starting to change his way of thinking. And that's quite an interesting technique from Dickens, because it really signals to us, and it sort of signposts the earlier parts of the novella. So his ignorance and lack of charity are sort of revealed to him by the second ghost. And this forces him to countenance things such as Tiny Tim's wretched condition, and then also, of course, he reveals to him the personifications of ignorance and want, which is, for Scrooge, quite a horrifying revelation, and maybe to some of the readers at the time as well. So if we have a look at one of the early descriptions of the ghost Christmas present, he says, I am the ghost of Christmas present, said the spirit, look upon me. So look at me, look me in the eye. And I think this is quite an interesting one, because we've got like this sort of allusion to Father Christmas. And then there are things such as the holly wreath, which is sort of a crown of Christmas. It's symbolic of goodness, and it links all those ideas of the Christian values to the values of Christmas and humanitarianism. And perhaps, a message from Scrooge that let's not become, because there's quite a lot of commodification of Christmas at this stage. And some of our Christmas traditions, such as Prince Albert having the Christmas tree gift, the ginormous one, some of those traditions have come during this period of time. So you think, don't forget about the actual true values of Christmas. We've got also semantic fields of light and happiness. And at the end, there's an interesting description, because he's got this sort of antique scabbard that holds a sword, but there's no sword in it. And it's eaten up with rust. He's long since left all vehicles for violence behind. He has no longer a need of those. So again, it's something which is signalling to Scrooge to the future, even though he's the ghost of the Christmas present. So then we get the ghost of Christmas future, and this shrouded spectre is associated with the Grim Reaper. His task is to make Scrooge feel that ignorance and want that the previous ghost has shown to him. He's horrified by how little his death means to others, because of course he's shown his grave and he hears what people say about him. It shows he's completely ignorant to the impact he's had on people. and how his material possessions are greedily pawned off by strangers. And you know, the way that Caroline speaks about him to her husband, how pleased she is that she's no longer under his threat. So while I can't, there's a potential theory here that some people have raised, and it's their belief that perhaps under the black cloak and hood is the corpse of Scrooge's future self, only his pale, cold hand pointing the way forward, as if symbolising how the decisions made by that hand have directed it to this fate. And this sort of protrudes underneath his funeral robes. And that's quite an interesting one, isn't it? That there's no specific evidence for that, but I can see how that could be an interpretation of the text. And really, when Scrooge is forced to confront his mortality, the fact that he is going to die, the lesson is cemented then in his heart. So he has to learn to face reality and accept the responsibilities of awareness from the first ghost, to feel the emotion and compassion and goodwill towards his fellow man, which comes in the form of the charity and warmth in the second ghost. And by the time he wakes up on Christmas Day looks radically different from Christmas Eve. So the night before had been strangled by brown smog, as we talked about earlier. And Scrooge's office is mere sort of phantoms, and preventing him from seeing any of the pedestrians outside as sort of three-dimensional human beings. He just sees them as people sort of drifting around. But on Christmas Day, it's blindingly bright, with sunlight gleaming on the snow and a clear sky revealing the faces of the people walking past him. And so this really amplifies this sort of transformation that he's had. This transformation is one that puts a premium on individual responsibility for one's fellows. And so therefore, through this time, through the fact that it is such a short period of time from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, and the playing around with that time through the fragmented narrative really allows Dickens, I think, to emphasise that urgency of the message. So if we have a look here a little bit more closely in the original initial descriptions, we've got a triplet here, a triple of adverbs, slowly, gravely, silently, and there is some sibilance in that which makes them seem even more sinister. They're sort of growing in influence, I think, the ghosts as we go through the novel, but also growing in stature, growing in levels of fear or terror. We need to talk also about the word shrouded, because this is polysemic. It means it's open, it's got multiple interpretations. It's quite ambiguous. So a shroud is a funeral cloth, but it also means to conceal or to protect or to screen. So actually the ghost is doing all of these things. He is in a funeral cloth because he's linking to this idea of Scrooge's death, and he's trying to emphasize his mortality to help the message seem more urgent. But he's also concealing himself. But is he protecting Scrooge? It reminds us of the obscurity at the beginning, and the ignorance that Scrooge feels. And I think that's also amplified in this quote: the difficulty to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded just links us back around to this idea of obscurity that he now maybe is released from, or at least we hope, and he therefore is when he wakes up on Christmas Day. And the idea of solemn dread is he could be damned just as Marley. And I think it's at the end he says, I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, said Scrooge. Spirit answered not, but pointed onwards with his hand. So there's a terror in the silence through this ghost, but it also sort of emphasises his ability to show Scrooge and enable him to learn himself in this final stage of Scrooge's transformation. So the ghosts are incredibly important and significant in illustrating Dickens's message, really, but also they act as a really fantastic structural element because it takes us really clearly through the action in the novel, but also through Scrooge's slow transformation from past to present to future. And I think that's why they're so fascinating to explore. Okay, hope you found this video useful. Leave me a comment and let me know how you found it, and any feedback. Thank you so much.